Hello and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to do a relatively quick-ish comparison of the autofocus of the Fujifilm X-M5 against the X-H2S with the latest firmware. In the comparison, I'm going to be using this 18-55 f2.8 to f4 zoom lens. And the reason for that, I had just published a video testing the autofocus of the X-H2S on the latest firmware, and I was using the 16 f1.4 and the 33mm f1.4 at f1.4 because I wanted to stress the autofocus as much as possible. And I had a question in the comments of that video: what would the autofocus look like on some more affordable lenses that aren't f1.4? So that's why I'm using this f2.8 to f4 zoom lens. I'm recording this portion of the video on the X-M5 with the 33mm f1.4 at f1.4. So there is another example of how the autofocus is going to work, just so you know. I also had another question from a viewer asking me to compare the 6.2K open gate in f-log2 against the X-H2S. And I was going to do that for all of the comparisons in this video, but I messed up the first little autofocus comparison. I forgot to put the X-H2S into open gate, so it's just in 4K. And I also forgot to match the white balances, and I forgot to change the sharpness and noise reduction settings in the X-M5. So I will make that comparison later in the video. I want to explain what open gate is for those of you who don't know. If you do know, then feel free to skip past this. These mirrorless cameras typically have a sensor with a 3:2 aspect ratio. But when you shoot video, that is usually in a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is wider than the 3:2 of the full sensor. So what ends up happening is the camera will just crop the tops and bottoms of the sensor off to give you that wider aspect ratio. Cameras that allow you to shoot open gate, like the Fujifilm X-M5 and the X-H2S, shoot video using the entire sensor without cropping anything. As for why you would want to do that, there are a number of different reasons, but one of the most common ones is to be able to crop different aspect ratios of the same clip. So if you shot 3:2, then you can get a 16:9 widescreen, and you also could get a 9:16 vertical video out of the same clip without having to do so much cropping as if you had just shot in 16:9. You also may just want to use the 3:2 aspect ratio for a different look, so it's more square than we're typically used to seeing, and maybe you're going for like a nostalgic look, something referencing TVs back in the day that used to be 4:3. This is definitely closer than 16:9. So hopefully that made sense, and let's jump back into the autofocus comparison. As far as the autofocus settings, I'm using multi, face, eye, auto, and I tested with the default speed and sensitivity settings because I feel like a lot of people are probably just going to use the defaults. And then I also tested in my preferred settings for this kind of use case, which is +4 sensitivity and +2 speed. In my latest X-H2S autofocus test, I did more parameters. I tested in more settings, so if you want to see what that looks like, feel free to go back and check that video. Again, I think that the autofocus in both of these cameras is going to be very, very similar. I think one of the biggest issues that I'm seeing with the autofocus with the latest firmware on the X-H2S and now with the X-M5 is the consistency. Like when I am sort of looking through the handle of the coffee mug, I feel like on the X-H2S video that I just published about a week ago, it was able to track my eye through that better. Maybe I was just doing it differently, but both the X-M5 and the X-H2S struggle in this scenario doing that. I'm noticing that both cameras are able to track me as I move forward and backward in the chair, whereas on my previous video, the X-H2S sometimes just was slow to pick me up as I lean further back in the chair. So again, it's like this consistency thing. If you haven't been following along, one of the big improvements that Fujifilm has made is in its stickiness. So when it does find face and eye, if that's the mode that you're in, it doesn't get as distracted or distracted as easily by objects that are in front of or get closer to the lens. So you can see that here with the coffee mug, but it does lose the eye more frequently than I think it should, like when it's still visible. It's also interesting that the X-M5 is seeing the mouse as something to track on my desk. Another big improvement is when the subject that the camera is tracking leaves the frame, that it doesn't immediately rack focus to the background when you have the sensitivity set to +4, which is the locked on setting. Another thing I notice is like when I turn around in the chair, that it will sort of widen out to a head and then it widens out to a body, but then it just stops tracking my body altogether. And then I don't know what it's looking at. I don't know if it's still focused on me or if maybe it's focused on the chair. But it's weird that when you turn around, that it doesn't remember that you are a person. Or like as soon as your face and eye leave the frame, it kind of briefly knows that you're still there, but then quickly forgets. I think you can tell, like if you go back and watch my earlier autofocus tests, or maybe you will go watch Edward's autofocus test where he often will, or usually always test at f1.4. I think having a lens that doesn't open up as wide, so f2.8 on the sit down portions here, and then at about f3.2 on the stand up portions later in the video, that obviously helps a lot. It has a much deeper depth of field, and that minimizes obviously what the lens and the camera have to do, but also I think it covers up some of the pulsing, or like when you turn around and the camera sort of shifts around and doesn't track 100% perfectly. Like those kinds of things can be masked because the depth of field is so much deeper. What about the image quality comparison? So again, the question was, what does it look like in 6.2 open gate and f-log2 in comparison to the X-H2S? And I think no surprises, the image quality is really, really good on the X-M5. That is using the same sensor as the X-T3, the X-T4, the X-S20, same amount of megapixels, so 26 megapixels in the X-H2S as the X-M5. So you're getting very similar detail. Obviously the resolution is the same. The processor is the same in both cameras as well. No real reason that the raw image quality out of the X-M5 shouldn't be very, very good and very comparable to the X-H2S. All the settings are identical. I changed the sharpness settings to -4 in both cameras and the noise reduction settings to their minimum values in both cameras. So you're getting a very unprocessed and raw image out of both. I didn't color grade these clips either. I just used the included f-log2 conversion in Final Cut Pro. I overexposed both by about a stop. So I adjusted the exposure in Final Cut Pro back down about a stop. Okay, I think I covered everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the X-M5, the X-H2S, you want to bitch about Fuji autofocus some more, just throw it in there. I really appreciate watching, and maybe I'll see you in another video.